We don't know what the unwind mechanism is at this point. So all we can do is say, if we reach this point, does this change the timeline for the White House? I'll say, my favorite show is Andor. The character Luthien always, he has his rules, and he says, rule number one, design your exit on the way in. And the question is, what exit have we designed?
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here.
Welcome to a special Smarter Markets episode, Iranian conflict, Geopolitics and Energy Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Helima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets. Helima sat down with us yesterday to discuss the current state of play in the conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States, its implications for global geopolitics and energy markets, and the inflection points to watch to determine how the situation may unfold. Happy Friday. I'm sure it's been a heck of a week for you. So thank you for making the time today to help us understand the current state of the conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and its wider implications for world geopolitics and the energy markets. I feel like we're keeping the streak going. When you were on the podcast last year, the U.S. and Israel had just struck Iran's nuclear facilities. And I remember you saying at the time that the big open question was whether the conflict could be parked for now, could we consider it done, or would Iran seek to reconstitute its nuclear program and risk further military action by the U.S. and Israel? Is that what happened? Why did the U.S. and Israel choose to attack Iran now?
David, thank you for that question. And what's so interesting is if you look at the national security strategy that was released by the White House in mid-December, the focus was really on the Western Hemisphere, that was going to be the priority for the United States, hemispheric dominance, Monroe Doctrine 2.0. That was very clear we were going into Venezuela. You could even see a path to an escalation over Greenland. But if you looked at the section on the Middle East, the viewpoint at the time was that the Middle East was sort of on cruise control, that we had done so much militarily against Iran, against the nuclear program in June, that we had reinvigorated our ties with Gulf states, that while the Middle East was still important, it wasn't the core priority of the American administration. And then we had the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Mar-a-Lago on New Year's Eve. And I remember I was actually down in Palm Beach at the time, and we had to scramble to write a note. It was called Postcard from Palm Beach, targeting Tehran, because it was so interesting in that press conference that you had President Trump for the first time say, Iran cannot have missiles, Iran cannot kill demonstrators. And all of a sudden, we were changing our goalpost in terms of what could constitute action that would mandate or potentially lead to a U.S. military response. Before it had been strictly nuclear, now we were basically adding in two more categories that could lead to coercive U.S. action. And so from really then on, I felt we were kind of in a launch sequence for another U.S. military engagement. We couldn't do it at the same time we were doing Venezuela. We had to move assets from that theater to the Middle East. But once we had the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it was pretty clear that we were going in. Now, what is interesting is I had been in the region at the end of January, beginning of February, and really senior leaders that we spoke to there believed that President Trump would back down because the Iranians had made it so clear that it wasn't going to be like June, that they were going to target the regional powers to really try to internationalize the cost of the U.S. and Israeli action. They would go after critical economic and energy infrastructure to really try to push President Trump's pain buttons when it comes to oil prices and the affordability agenda. And that's what's really playing out now. And so, what I think is very interesting is given that there were clear and cogent warnings from the Gulf about the risk to their key economic and energy facilities, the airports, critical infrastructure, what did the White House, what type of preparation did the White House have for this action for the day after? What rule books, what was their idea of how this was going to play out?
And in terms of how it plays out from here, as everyone's question is, and this was a question you pointed out last year, what does Iran have left to retaliate with? So if they want to try to regionalize it, following the Israeli response to the October 7th attacks by Hamas, many of Iran's most important surrogates were decimated, including Hamas and Hezbollah. Iran, as you had pointed out at the time, lost a key ally in Syrian President Assad when he was overthrown by rebels. And now there's, well, like just in Iran itself, how many missiles, how many launchers?
I think it's down but not out. And I think what's really important is were we thinking about it in terms of like the last wars and not focusing on the drone capabilities? And I think that is something that people may have missed with the focus on like how many missiles do they have? How many launchers do they have? Well, Iran is a prolific producer of low cost drones. In fact, they are so good at drone production that they have shipped thousands of those drones to Russia. And so Iran is thought to have abundant stockpiles of drones. The other thing is that while Hezbollah and Hamas have suffered serious blows, the Houthis are still thought to retain significant capabilities. And then there are the militias in Iraq as well. So the axis of resistance is not entirely a spent force. And they do potentially have cells in a number of countries in the region as well that could be potentially activated. So as the Iranian missile stockpiles are dwindling, you're increasingly seeing them using their drone capabilities. And the real problem we're also facing is that many of our key allies in the region, particularly the Gulf states, their interceptor stocks are running perilously low as well. And so when we think about this conflict extending in the next few weeks, the question is, will Iran be able to carry out more lethal attacks with its drones if the interceptor stockpiles are thin or non-existent?
And what sort of targets are the drones used against? And have we seen them being used effectively up till now in this conflict?
Well, I think what's so interesting is the way that Iran can move things up the escalator ladder. And we're talking today when Brent prices have now just crossed $90. They haven't had to do any serious action in the Strait of Hormuz to effectively close it. You can do enough with drone strikes on select tankers, select infrastructure to raise the fear premium for shipping companies and insurance companies to largely avoid the Strait of Hormuz. But the Iranians have done, significant attacks on airports, select tankers off of key ports. They have attacked UAE's Fujairah facility multiple times. And even if the fires are started by falling debris from drones, you're still having fires, shutdowns. And then really importantly for global gas markets is the fact Qatar has shut down Ras Laffan, the world's largest LNG facility, with no signs of an imminent restart there. And so even if the reports are true that maybe the damage was minimal, Qatar has made the decision that they do not believe the environment is safe enough to restart the largest natural gas LNG facility in the world. And I think that is really important because, David, I'm sure we're going to talk about what's the de-risking infrastructure to the Strait of Hormuz for oil. There is no de-risking infrastructure for Qatari LNG.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that. But first, I wanted to come back to a point you made earlier, which was when you see Iran attacking its neighbors, the neighboring Gulf states, on the one hand, it could look like a desperate lashing out, but it sounds like that was kind of the strategy going in to increase the pain, put pressure on global energy prices. Is it being effective? How are the neighboring countries responding and how are they aligning themselves?
Time will tell because we are still, I think, early days in this conflict. And the interceptors have worked to a degree, but they're not perfect. Some drone strikes are being successful. Some cases we have falling debris hitting infrastructure. But what's this going to look like a week from now when these interceptor stockpiles, as I said, are non-existent or very, very thin. And if they can do this much damage when these countries have interceptors, again, what's it going to look like when these stockpiles are severely diminished? So I think, yes, we focus on the diminishing missile stockpiles for Iran, but if we believe that they have relatively abundant drone capabilities, I think that this conflict could get worse in terms of the destruction on facilities in the Gulf in the coming days and weeks.
And you had mentioned that Iran really moved up on the agenda for the US after Netanyahu met with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. There have been a number of news articles this week, like USA Today had one stating that Israel had decided to kill Iran's leader after the October 7th attack. Another article in Fortune discussing how the October 7th attacks led to a multi-year destruction, she said, down but not out, of Iran's proxy militias. And I wanted to ask you, how big a turning point was October 7th? Did that fundamentally change the status quo in the region?
I think it changed Israel's security doctrine in the region. And so I do think that we have seen a much more serious Israeli effort to degrade capabilities of countries and non-state actors that they view as direct threats to the state of Israel. And so was this almost inevitable after October 7th that it would end with the killing of the supreme leader? I think that's a really interesting and open question. But in terms of where we go now, I think that the most important question regarding Israel is, do the interests of Israel, are the United States and Israel on the same page when it comes to endgame for Iran? There's some really interesting and well thoughtful Israel security experts like Dennis Achredowitz, who is really talking about Israel being comfortable with a balkanized Iran at the end game. They do not want the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, retaining any control over Iran, and that their security interests would be satisfied with an Iran that doesn't have a strong leadership. They just don't want the IRGC in control, so they're willing to have a balkanized state. And you can see support for groups like the Kurds, trying to put pressure on the IRGC internally. The question is that the President Trump end state? There had been some thought that maybe President Trump would try to find the Revolutionary Guard equivalent of Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. And we did the deal with basically the remnants of the Maduro regime, or basically everybody but Maduro when it came to Venezuela, basically work with the existing structure. Some thought was once the Supreme Leader was gone, that President Trump would sort of define success down and say, here's someone we can work with. We've killed the Supreme Leader. We've degraded missile capabilities. We've set back the nuclear program further, like mission accomplished, like we're done. The real question, I think, is, are we going for a more expansive regime eradication goal in Iran, which would probably align ourselves more with the Israelis, who fear a more immediate threat of Iran in the region because they live there? Or is it going to be more circumscribed in terms of what the US will define as success? If we are going for a more maximalist intervention or a maximalist end goal, that's a much longer conflict. And then we really, I think, have to think about like more serious economic and energy ripple effects.
And when you said balkanization, do you see that as more not one ruling political party, but more counterbalanced political forces within the country? Or do you actually see the country dividing?
Again, you may not have it like totally split up, but you could have a contest for power and not a strong central government emerging. I think that is one of the scenarios that people are starting to think about, because there doesn't seem to be a particularly strong opposition leader that is, building a, national consensus to rule. In the case of Venezuela, it was actually, you could point to Gonzalez, you could point to even Juan Guaido had won the election and, Trump won, and say that they had elections. And even if the election results, there was issues that the people couldn't take over. You could say that there were viable candidates that seemed to have a national following. In the case of Iran, I think there's a concern that we don't seem to have several official people that people can coalesce around. So it raises questions about how serious our intervention is going to have to be to create a viable opposition to the IRGC.
And is there anyone on the short list of who could be that viable opposition?
You heard President Trump in the sense he pulled a Machado when it comes to Crown Prince Pahlavi saying, I saw it, but not him. So that again, and he said recently, overnight that he wanted to pick the supreme leader. So we don't know where the United States government is actually going to land on this. Again, I think that's why when people ask, like, how does this end? What's the timeline? I think a lot of the questions will be determined by what's the willingness of President Trump to really go for a much more sweeping change of government in Iran, or whether he is going to look to find some type of group that he can work with, the remnants of the ancient regime.
Well, I want to come back to energy markets and the implications of this conflict on it. As you mentioned, this time, of course, that means LNG as well as oil, and Qatar Energy's halted its LNG production, which is about 20% of the world's export capacity. We often focus on the Straits of Hormuz, but this itself is a massive event, right?
It's a massive event what's happened with the Qatari facilities. It's also a massive event what's happening with storage. The fact that you cannot move Iraqi oil through the Strait of Hormuz, Iraq has limited storage. Iraq is going to very soon, we've already shut in about 1.5 million barrels of Iraqi exports. Come next week, Iraq will probably have to shut down everything. And then you're starting to think about cascading shut-ins. Will Kuwait soon have to start shutting in? Will we get to a situation, if we go out another week, that Saudi Arabia has to start shutting in? And so that becomes challenging for the market, because even if you resolve this current conflict, the start times will vary country by country, infrastructure by infrastructure, field by field. So it's not going to be like a light switch. And again, the determination of the timeline for this war really rests in Washington. Like, what does President Trump define as success?
And what's been the response in the oil and gas markets? We've seen a number of these periods where there isn't much of a response. Certainly this time has been different.
Well, David, I think what was interesting was the relatively muted response after the initial US bombing campaign. I think there was a corner of the market that thought it was going to look just like June, that it was going to be quick, that it was going to be limited in terms of Iranian response, and that it would be something that would not be disruptive for energy flows. And so that's why I think you saw only a small run up, because again, David, we've talked about this for years. So many people got burned on betting on a Russian disruption that did not materialize. And then after October 7th, we've had these like brief run ups. And then people realize really no supplies at risk, and they fade the story and they go back to fundamentals and discussions about oversupplied market. And so even when we were writing on the views from the Gulf, like, it didn't gain that much traction. People were like, okay, you're warning us, but like, let's look at past practice. And every time someone warned us, those warnings didn't prove to be particularly prescient, and you made money fading the story the moment the bomb started coming down. So I think there were a lot of people who just had a bit of recency bias. And we kept saying, like, we should maybe expand our angle, make a wider angle lens, and look to 2019, where after we reimposed maximum pressure sanctions in Iran, like, they did hit tankers off the coast of Fujairah. They did over the summer, and I think is a very important point. They did hit the East-West pipeline, which is that key diversionary route that Saudi Arabia would use. And then they did that spectacular attack on Abqaiq in September, the world's largest oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia, temporarily knocking off half of Saudi production. I was in UAE right after the tankers were hit. I was in Saudi right after Abqaiq. And I can tell you there was a view that these were spectacular warning shots, that the Iranians could have done much more significant damage to these tankers and key facilities, but wanted to send a message. And the concern I always had after visiting this country was, what if Iran was intent on actually like utilizing their full destructive capabilities? What would the market have looked like? And I think now Iran is incentivized to use its full destructive capabilities. And so the longer this goes on, And as I said, the interceptor stockpiles diminish. Are we going to see more disruptive attacks?
And what's the world's ability to absorb physically that loss of oil and gas, whether it's from SPR releases or increased production elsewhere?
This is all about duration. I mean, you can certainly see the White House now scrambling with the announcement that we were going to roll back the enforcement of sanctions on Russian crude to India. And so India will be able to access exports from the two major energy producers, Rosneft and Lukoil. There's Russian floating storage that can be now tapped. That probably gets you like a month. So the question is, again, if we are in a full military conflict with Iran that extends beyond several weeks, we're going to run through a lot of the available, official storage, which I would count as, strategic stockpiles, and like the non-official storage, which I would count as like the sanctioned barrels on the water.
And has there been any coordination between governments with like SPR releases or anything like that? Or
What's fascinating to me is that which countries seem to have seen the writing on the wall. Part of the reason why I was not the most bearish analyst when it came to oil prices was we had heard that the Chinese had been aggressively buying for the SPR for non-commercial reasons. I think we had talked about that over the summer. That led us to believe that, if China is going to be investing in expanding their storage capabilities and are buying a very significant clip and for non-commercial reasons, why are they doing that? And we had spoken to very senior US officials who had said China's buying to de-risk disruption coming out of the Middle East, also preparing for conflict with the United States, which is a little worrying when we think about the Taiwan story. But there raises a really interesting question of, was China engaged in better risk management than the United States? I mean, we had the opportunity when oil prices were low to buy back for SPR, and we did not. So we have, I think, 400 and change million and change in the SPR. That's useful, but again, duration will matter. And right now, the administration is essentially tapping the SPR on the water of the Russian barrels. But once you run through that, the question is, will we do a coordinated stockpile release? Fatih Birol from the IEA was just out saying there's no shortage of supply. Well, okay, if you can't move the barrels, well, the Middle East is now having stranded assets. So yes, there is oil in theory, but if it can't reach markets, it's stranded. And once it's all shut in, you don't have that oil available.
and when you think about how Russia and China would or might respond next, sounds like in the immediate term, it's been a slight benefit to Russia in terms of they can sell the oil in higher prices, but Iran's always been their ally.
Well, what's interesting is that Russia, I think, benefits in the near term in multiple ways. Now they get a higher price for the oil they can send to India. So they get full economics at this stage. They probably don't have to sell it at a discount or not a significant discount at this stage. Then you have the fact that we are going to have to divert Patriot missiles that would have been going to Ukraine to the Middle East. So they are going to have a weaker Ukraine to contend with, at least when it comes to air defenses. And then, there are reports in the Washington Post out this morning that the Russians are assisting the Iranians with targeting US military assets. And so it leaves the question of like, are the Russians happy to see the United States tied down in the Middle East?
When you think about the loss of LNG, do you think Europe at some point starts being more open to taking Russian LNG or Russian gas?
I think the interesting question about Europe is like, how are you going to see splits within the 27 member states? I mean, it's always important to think about with sanctions, like what's the body putting the sanctions in place? Like there's a reason why President Trump can essentially waive the Russia sanctions for India is because that was done by the executive branch. They were not congressional sanctions, which is the principal body to put sanctions on in the case of Iran. When it comes to Russia and European sanctions, they were done by the EU. And so getting the sort of 27 member states to agree on a a waiver or a rollback, that's going to be more challenging. So again, I think it's always important to think about like, where did the sanctions emanate? What's the repeal process? Like one of my favorite writers had talked about early stages on Iran sanctions, that they were essentially becoming spider webs because of different jurisdictions. And so in the case of Europe, you always have to think about like, what was the body that put those sanctions in place? And I think the Europeans have just a different threat perception as well when it comes to Russia. So they're going to have to balance their economic concerns with also what is a Russia that has a restocked ATM do for their security needs. And then the other thing to think about, David, and we've got so much to talk about, is if you're Ukraine and now you are not getting the Patriots you probably anticipated, you're facing a Russia that may have a financial windfall. And it's really been Russian cash that it's enabled Russia to stay in the game. They've been able to pay, we've talked about, they have a massive manpower advantage because they can pay people to fight. And so now Russia is going to be able to continue that recruitment effort the longer this war goes on. And if you're Ukraine, are you more incentivized to attack Russian energy infrastructure as well to make sure they don't have the barrels that they can monetize? So we have that attack on Novorossiysk, that really important Black Sea port. We've had Russian tankers attacked by Ukraine. We haven't been paying as much attention because we have all of this going on in the Middle East. But I would be watching as well, how does Ukraine respond? Do they escalate their infrastructure attacks because they feel the urgency to stop Russia from getting a financial lifeline?
And meanwhile, China, I imagine, is also watching. You said they were pretty forward-looking risk managers going into this. How do you think about how they respond next?
It's going to be interesting because it's a real question of like how big are their strategic buffers in terms of energy. We've seen announcements that they are limiting their own exports of product. So, at what point do the Chinese become concerned that they don't have, that their stockpiles of key commodities are being imperiled, that they try to get involved in negotiations? But I think the question is like, if Iran is facing an existential threat, like if you're the Revolutionary Guard and you're hearing complete surrender, the evisceration of your ruling, regime, do you care that much that the Chinese are angry? Like if you were in a battle for survival, I always find it interesting. People are saying, well, the Gulf states are going to be mad at them. I'm like, well, if they're facing regime survival, if, death is what you are facing, like that's a pretty strong incentive just to keep going in the hopes that you can change Washington's calculus.
And how are you thinking about where oil and gas markets go next?
I think that the oil market was a lagging indicator. I'd written before, the oil market's become something of a broken barometer for gauging risk in the system. And I've always said, like, now oil reacts through the fact it's not really an indicator of where we're going. And so with Brent, crossing 90, is it becoming a more accurate indicator of the risk? I think if we continue and, this becomes a multi-week effort, that's when you're talking about triple digit levels. Like once the market believes this is not a short duration conflict. Like if this were to end tomorrow, you would still have some, significant supply issues on restarts, but you would see an unwind of a lot of this run up. But this is going to be an extended duration event. And the market believes that this is not going to be over in a matter of days or a week. Then I think you're going to, move another leg higher.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Helima. I really appreciate it. I know this has been a week where you've probably been talking nonstop, so we appreciate you making time to discuss this with us. Said one more question I wanted to ask you. I think you've emphasized over and over today that so much depends on duration. Like how long does it go on? President Trump has said the conflict could last 4 to 5 weeks. Could you kind of sum up what you're looking at to understand how events unfold? I know you think a lot of it probably sits in Washington, but how are you thinking about what are the signposts people should be looking for?
I think we're going to be reaching important inflection points. So where are we once the interceptor stockpiles are perilously low, either non-existent or very, very, very thin. How does that change the assessment in the White House? Because then are you having your key allies essentially sitting almost naked with Iranian drone attacks? So is that a moment of like inflection for the White House? And then as you potentially cross certain like thresholds in terms of price, we know President Trump does not like high energy prices. That is low energy prices has been one of his economic success stories. Like, does that cause an inflection point for him? Like I'm watching for like these moments where potentially dynamics change. Does it cause a reassessment? Because then you get reports from the Pentagon that they're preparing this to run through September. So we don't know what the unwind mechanism is at this point. So all we can do is say, if we reach this point, does this change the timeline for the White House? I will say, my favorite show is Andor. The character Luthenville always, he has his rules and he says, rule number 1, design your exit on the way in. And the question is like, what exit have we designed?
Thanks again to Helima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with the next episode of our podcast series, Weathering Decarbonization. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abax.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.